Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the sounds of words matter more than we think? Like, does the way a word sounds actually connect to its meaning in a deeper way? Well, this fascinating new study dives right into that question. Today we're exploring how our brains handle words, specifically the idea that maybe words aren't just random labels for things. For a long time, scientists thought the link between a word's sound and its meaning was pretty much an accident, like a coin flip. But what if there are patterns, little clues in the sounds themselves that hint at what the word is about? This research suggests that our brains might be picking up on these sound-meaning connections, especially when it comes to concrete things versus abstract ideas. So researchers wanted to see if our brains actually use these sound-to-meaning patterns, especially for words about concrete things versus abstract concepts. Think chair for concrete, and justice for abstract. They had people listen to words and non-words and used fMRI to see which parts of their brains lit up. And guess what? They found that certain brain areas involved in understanding words also responded to non-words that sounded like they might relate to concrete things. This suggests our brains are really good at picking up on these subtle sound patterns, and they're a big part of how we understand what words mean. Let's dig a bit deeper. The big question is, how do we get meaning from words? And how on earth do we understand the difference between a concrete thing like a leg, which we can touch and see, and an abstract concept like love, which is much harder to pin down in our senses? Science has different ideas. Some theories say concrete words are easier because we can imagine them with our senses, like feeling a leg or seeing a chair. Abstract words, on the other hand, might be more like linguistic puzzles built from language itself. There is evidence for both sides, and sometimes it is confusing. Some researchers think concrete words are easier to process because we have more information about them from our senses. Others say abstract words might be harder because they rely more on language and need more control from our brain to figure out their meaning, especially if there are similar sounding words. But here is where it gets really interesting. For a long time, the idea that word sounds are totally random was pretty much the standard. However, some newer theories are starting to look at words that aren't totally random. Think of onomatopoeia like buzz or splash, where the sound actually mimics the thing it describes. This is called iconicity, but this study is looking at something even broader and more common. Systematicity or form typicality, this is about statistical patterns. For example, certain sounds or sound combinations might be more likely to appear in words that refer to concrete things, and other sounds might show up more in abstract words. It is like a subtle statistical signal hidden in the sound. The researchers here decided to investigate this concreteness form typicality. They wanted to know if the brain activity we see when we process words actually reflects these statistical patterns between word sounds and whether they refer to concrete or abstract concepts. So they designed an experiment to find out. They gathered a group of healthy participants, 21 of them, all native English speakers. They made sure everyone had normal hearing and vision and no history of any brain-related issues. The number of participants was based on similar studies, aiming for a solid group to get reliable results. Now, for the clever part, they took words that were rated as very concrete and others that were rated as very abstract. Crucially, they made sure these words were matched on a bunch of other features, like how common they are, how many letters they have, and even how emotional they sound. This way, they could be more sure that any differences they saw were really about concreteness and not something else. They also created non-word sounds that aren't actual words but were designed to have similar sound patterns to the concrete words or the abstract words. This is important because non-words don't have established meanings. So if the brain reacts to them in a similar way to actual words, it strongly suggests the brain is reacting to the sound patterns themselves. Their main task was a kind of listening game called an auditory lexical decision task. Participants listened to spoken words and non-words. Their job was to decide as quickly and accurately as they could whether they heard a real English word or a made-up non-word. This task forces people to engage with the sound of the word and decide if it fits into their mental dictionary. While they were doing this, their brains were being scanned using fMRI. fMRI measures brain activity by detecting changes in blood flow. When a part of the brain is working harder, it needs more oxygen, so blood flow increases there. This is how they could see which brain areas were active during the task. They used a powerful 3 Tesla MRI scanner to get detailed images of the brain structure and activity. They collected a lot of data, making sure to get clear pictures of the brain's responses. First, let's look at what people did. The researchers analyzed how accurate people were and how long it took them to respond. Interestingly, participants participants were a bit more accurate when deciding if something was a word or not if it was abstract, but they were faster at identifying real words overall compared to non-words. This tells us that just being a real word versus a made-up one is a big signal for the brain, and there is a slight difference in how easily abstract words are processed for accuracy. Now, for the main event, what happened in the brain? When they directly compared real words to their sound, unlike non-words, some interesting things popped up. For example, abstract non-words actually triggered more activity than real abstract words in certain brain areas, like the left superior temporal gyrus. This suggests the brain was really picking up on the sound patterns in those non-words. Maybe even more strongly than the familiar words in some cases, because they lacked semantic meaning and were thus perceived as non-words. Then, they directly compared abstract words to concrete words. Abstract words lit up areas in the left occipital gyrus and parts of the brain in the front, including the anterior cingulate cortex. Concrete words, on the other hand, activated a wider network of areas mostly in the left hemisphere, including parts of the middle temporal gyrus, the fusiform gyrus, and the angular gyrus. This is where we start to see concrete and abstract words activating different, though sometimes overlapping, brain regions. This pattern was also seen when comparing abstract non-words to concrete non-words, showing that these sound patterns themselves were influencing brain activity. For instance, concrete non-words activated those left hemisphere regions we just mentioned, similar to concrete words. But the really powerful finding comes from the conjunction analysis. This is where they looked for brain areas that showed activity for both real words and their sound, alike non-words when comparing concrete versus abstract concepts. This is the key. They found that a significant network of brain regions, particularly in the left hemisphere, responded similarly to both concrete words and concrete sounding non-words. This included areas like the middle temporal gyrus, the angular gyrus, and the posterior cingulate. The same happened for abstract concepts, which activated areas like the dorsomedial frontal cortex in both words and non-words. So what does this all mean? The researchers conclude that these systematic sound meaning mappings, these statistical regularities between word sounds and their meaning, especially related to concreteness, are not just a small quirk of language, they are a fundamental part of how our brains represent and process meaning. When they saw the same brain areas lighting up for both real words and non-words that sounded like they belonged to a certain category, concrete or abstract, they knew it wasn't just about knowing the word's dictionary definition. It was about the sound itself carrying information. This supports the idea that our brains are constantly learning statistical patterns from the language around us. From a very young age, we pick up on which sounds tend to appear with concrete objects, and which sounds might be associated with more abstract ideas. It is like building a predictive model in our minds. When we hear a new word, or even a non-word, our brain uses these learned statistical relationships to help us guess at its meaning or category. This is a big deal for how we think about the brain and language. It challenges the traditional view that word meanings are completely separate from how words sound. It suggests that our language network, the parts of the brain involved in language, is more integrated and responsive to these subtle form meaning links than we might have assumed. Theories that completely ignore sound, meaning relationships might be missing a big piece of the puzzle. Now, like all studies, this one has its limits. They use spoken words, and English has a pretty tricky spelling system. So, the findings might be a bit different if we were using written words. Also, they can't completely rule out that the non-words might have activated similar sound patterns to other unrelated words that weren't in their specific list, which could also influence brain activity, but overall, they're quite confident that the sublexical sound patterns are directly linking to meaning. In conclusion, this research strongly suggests that the sound of a word isn't just a ticket entry into our mental dictionary. It carries information, the statistical patterns in those sounds, especially regarding whether a word refers to something concrete or abstract, play a significant role in how our brains process language. This gives us a more grounded understanding of how abstract and concrete concepts are formed and accessed, suggesting they're deeply rooted in the phonetic acoustic features of the language we hear, learned through constant statistical processing. What I find so exciting about this research is how it highlights the incredible learning power of our brains. We're not just passively receiving words, we're actively uncovering patterns in the very fabric of language, the sounds themselves. It makes you think about how much unconscious learning is happening all the time, and it suggests that language might be more embodied or grounded in our sensory and motor experiences than many scientists previously believed, even for abstract ideas. The fact that non-words can evoke similar brain responses to real words, based on their sounds related to concreteness, is really compelling evidence that these sound-meaning relationships are fundamental. This opens up so many avenues for future research. How do these sound-meaning mappings differ across languages? Do children learn these patterns differently than adults? Can we use this knowledge to improve language learning, or even help people with language disorders? It would be fascinating to see how this plays out in different languages and with different types of concepts. Okay? That's it for this episode of RUBIN'S Mind Lab. What did you think of this research? Does it change how you think about words? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this exploration into how our minds work, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more amazing science insights. Well, see you in the next one.